Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
So, what's the deal with a God who seems to insist that you can only ever worship Him? Does that really make sense? Or does it rob you of your freedom? You might want to stay tuned for this.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
In recent programs, we've been talking about the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and I think the time has probably come to start just expounding on them one by one. Now, I'm not entirely sure I'm going to go through all 10 commandments in order, but I'll try to get to all of them. And what I really want to have happen is that you start to study them for yourselves. Today I'm going to start at the very top with the first commandment, which is the law against having other gods. So, here's the way that it reads in the version you find in Exodus chapter 20, which is probably the better known version of the 10 Commandments. You'll find another version in Deuteronomy chapter 5, which is kind of a repeat performance, a second telling that takes place a little later in Israel's history. And between the two versions, there are some minor variations in the wording that you should probably pay attention to because they provide you with all sorts of interesting things to think about. In particular, you'll find two different reasons given for keeping the Sabbath, or at least it seems that way when you first look at it, and I'll let you go and read that and wrestle with it on your own. But for today, let's just start at the very top and look at commandment number 1. And here's the way that it reads in Exodus 20, verse 1, where it says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And here comes the first commandment. "You shall have no other gods before me." Now, the first commandment really does start right at the top of the passage with those words, "I am the Lord your God," because that's the thought that kind of provides the glue that holds the rest of the moral law together. Because, after all, if there is no God, then there's not much point to studying His commandments, because they would just be a list of requirements dreamed up by some ancient so-called Hebrew prophet named Moses. I mean, it would still be interesting because those commandments have been so influential, but it would be like reading the ancient law code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian, or maybe the sayings of Confucius or some of the other famous sages who helped create the world's most notable civilizations. But the 10 Commandments are different because they begin with a distinct claim that these are God's words, and not just any old God, but the God of the Hebrews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Any number of ancient cultures claimed to worship large numbers of deities and demigods. But the God of the Hebrews was different. He claimed absolute exclusivity. This is Yahweh, the one true creator God, whose very name reminds us that His existence is underived and unborrowed. In fact, when Moses first met this God at the burning bush back in Exodus chapter 3, he defined himself as the I Am, which is a very unusual name if you think about it. Unless, of course, you happen to be the very definition of what existence is. You see, when you read the myths from other cultures, what you find is a list of gods whose existence is dependent on something or somebody else. Somehow, the pagans always felt this need to explain where their gods came from, and that's largely because their gods were the product of human imagination. In fact, when some of the Greek philosophers started to feel a little embarrassed by the terrible behavior of their gods, which is something we've covered on other episodes, some of them actually started to point out that their gods were made in our image, the human image. They resembled us. They were petty, violent, and salacious, just like we are. But the God of Scripture is completely different. In fact, you'll notice that when the story of the Bible opens with that famous line in Genesis chapter 1, it just says, "In the beginning, God." And it never bothers to tell us where He comes from. And that's because, well, He didn't come from anywhere. He's self-existent, which means that He doesn't depend on anything or anybody else. I guess you could say that the God of the Bible is non-contingent. And that's a detail that has given some skeptics a lot of headaches because, well, they can't seem to wrap their mind around what that's telling us. In the past, I've pointed out that guys like Richard Dawkins attack the existence of God exactly on this point. When believers insist that the universe looks like someone designed it, Dawkins made fun of them by essentially saying, well, then if everything that appears to be complex demands a designer, then who in the world designed your complex God? Now, to some people, that might look like a death blow to the design argument. But really it isn't. It's kind of like saying, here's a beautiful and sophisticated painting, and it has all the hallmarks of a Rembrandt. So we know that Rembrandt probably painted it. But then the skeptic says, well, then who painted Rembrandt? Nobody painted Rembrandt because Rembrandt is not a painting. So when somebody says who designed God, the answer is nobody, because God is not a creation. He's a creator, and there's a world of difference. God is the great I am, the only being whose existence does not depend on anything else. Of course, you and I derive our existence from Him. So it makes perfect sense that His moral code would begin with a statement reminding us of who He is versus who we are. I am Yahweh, your God. It's the perfect way to introduce the topic because we are not on the same level as God. And the one who made us is about to show us the very best way to live. Now, of course, this was originally addressed to the children of Israel, even though the moral principles found in the Ten Commandments are timeless and universal. It's not as if these were brand new laws that God thundered from the top of Sinai. Otherwise, you end up with a very strange proposition that murder and stealing were just absolutely fine before God spoke those words from Sinai. And obviously that can't possibly be true because the entire book of Genesis deals with people breaking God's law long before Mount Sinai. I mean, why in the world condemn Cain for killing Abel if it wasn't already wrong to murder? And did Abraham do wrong when he bore false witness to Abimelech? And really, what was the problem with the serpent lying to Eve? The Ten Commandments, of course, they're timeless principles. Now, in the world of 21st century Christianity, you'll sometimes hear people saying that the Ten Commandments were just for the Jews because of that opening statement at the very top of them. But let's just think about that for a moment. I mean, who else was God supposed to give the list of commandments to? To some other culture that didn't believe in Him? Of course not. Just because the Hebrew people were the vehicle through which God revealed Himself to the world doesn't mean that His revelation wasn't for everybody. And if you take the time to read the entire Bible, that becomes really, really obvious because it tells us that the Hebrews were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, my ancestors. They were supposed to reveal the love of Yahweh to absolutely everybody. So yes, the Ten Commandments were originally delivered to the people who were liberated from Egyptian slavery, but that doesn't mean that Yahweh is only for them. He belongs to all of us because He made all of us, and He wields authority over all of humanity. Now, I know I've read this to you before, but listen to this remarkable statement from Revelation chapter 4, where an assembly in heaven addresses God with these words. This is Revelation 4, verse 11. Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. Now, here's what we've got to think about. In the first commandment, God says, I am the Lord your God. So now we've got to ask ourselves, what does it mean to have a God? That's a question that Luther wrestled with in his large catechism. But right now I've got to take a quick break, so I'll be right back after this to tell you what Martin Luther said.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
I don't know if you ever had to go to catechism class when you were a kid, but I really did. we were required to go and learn the basics of the Christian faith, things like the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and of course, the Ten Commandments. Now, I did not grow up in a Lutheran tradition, so I actually studied a different set of catechisms. But if you happen to be Lutheran, what I'm about to share with you might just seem familiar. This is from Luther's Large Catechism. What is God, he asks? And the answer is, a God is that to which we look for all good, and in which we find refuge in every time of need. To have a God, says Luther, is nothing else than to trust and believe Him with our whole heart. As I have often said, the trust and faith of the heart alone make both God and an idol. If your faith and trust are right, then your God is the true God. On the other hand, if your trust is false and wrong, then you have not the true God. For these two belong together, faith and God. That to which your heart clings and entrusts itself is, I say, really your God. Now, that's a pretty good definition, and a good place to start unpacking the meaning of the first commandment, which challenges us to understand what it means to have a God, and it reminds us that everybody has one, whether they know it or not. If you place your absolute faith, your absolute trust in your own intellect, well, then your intellect becomes your God. If you trust scientific discovery to define your existence, to go beyond material fact and explain who you are and the purpose of your existence, well, then you've probably adopted a religion of scientism, even if you wouldn't want to call it a religion. We all seem to have this hardwired sense that there's something out there bigger than us, or at least we all appear to hope there is, and we have this instinct that our existence is supposed to mean something. Even if you happen to believe that we all just emerged into the universe by accident, there's still a big part of you that tries to make sense of it. You really want your existence to have purpose. And it's precisely on this point that everybody behaves like they're religious. I mean, you might practice a perfectly secular religion, which means you're probably going to really hate what I'm about to say, and I'm okay with that. But you will never convince me that you have a rational, comprehensive, secular explanation for everything. I mean, for starters, how in the world do you explain something like human consciousness? Here you are, self-aware, and you even find yourself kind of mystified by the fact that you exist. How in the world do you explain your conscious mind from a perfectly rational perspective? How do random molecules smashing into each other over billions of years somehow give rise, well, to you? To date, nobody has actually been able to explain this. And so there's a whole lot out there that we all take on faith, which means there really is such a thing as a secular religion because we all have religious beliefs. Again, to use the words of Martin Luther, that to which your heart clings and entrusts itself is your God. But of course, if you accept that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, is real, and you accept that we were put here by the will of God, and that's what you trust, well, then Yahweh becomes your God. Now, obviously, it's a little more complex than that. We're kind of oversimplifying, but still, I think Luther's definition works. What the first commandment tells us is that if you choose something besides the Creator that you're going to trust with your life, then whatever that is, it becomes your God. I know we tend to think of other gods as little statues that sit in a shrine or on the shelf in your house, but that's just a physical representation of what an idol actually is. And when we get to the second commandment, we're going to look at that. In reality, an idol is anything you elevate to the position of the Creator, either wittingly or unwittingly. And because we all seem to be wired for relationships, I guarantee you're going to elevate something to God's level if you don't have God. It might be power or money or sex or the writings of a philosopher or the prowess of some athletic team. I don't know. But if you're trusting something or somebody as the very highest guiding principle for your life and it is not God, well, that would be a violation of the first commandment. Now, I probably need to make something really, really clear before I move along, because unfortunately, some Christians have given the world the wrong impression. I remember a long time ago, I was holding a series of lectures on a university campus, and there was this young guy sitting in the front row who was getting agitated whenever I mentioned that I had faith in the Bible as a revelation of God's will, and it was the ultimate guide for my life. I noticed that he hung around a little bit when I was finished, so I went and sat with him. We made a bit of small talk, and then he told me what was eating at him. Are you saying that we should only read the Bible? What about all the other great thinkers who helped to shape our civilization? Now, honestly, I don't know where he got that impression, because if you know me, that's not what I teach or believe. If you've been watching this show for a while, you'll know that I tend to read a lot, not just the Bible. So I assured this kid I didn't mean to give that impression. We'd be foolish to just ignore everything that the great thinkers have tried to tell us. But if you're going to place absolute faith in what those writers say, I promise you, you're going to hit a wall. There's going to be a dead end, because it really is still just human opinion. So, do I read other books? Of course I do. But again, to use Luther's wording, I don't entrust myself to these people. I read them, I value them, sometimes I even admire them. But am I going to take my life and place it in the hands of a 19th century Enlightenment philosopher? Absolutely not. In fact, some of them actually lost their minds by taking their own ideas all the way to the end zone. Christianity doesn't mean shutting out the world completely or isolating yourself in the desert like one of those 4th century ascetic monks who disappeared from civilization just to avoid temptation. What the Bible actually teaches is that you and I need discernment. You're supposed to take the ideas you're exposed to and compare them to what God says. And if there's a difference, then the Christian goes with God. It's a matter of faith, but it's not a matter of blind faith. It's a matter of allowing God to inform your life, a matter of putting Him at the pinnacle of what you're going to trust. I am the Lord your God. And if that God is real, and if the claims of the Bible are real, then the first commandment makes really, really good sense. I mean, why in the world would you want to trust anybody or anything as a supreme guiding light if it isn't the one who made you? I mean, would you rather fix your car with my help or with the help of the engineer who designed that car? It's kind of a no-brainer. It's a little like the role that parents play. When your child first sets out to go and explore the world, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking because you as a parent know there are 1,001 voices out there who will try to tell your child what to do and how to live. And you know full well that none of those voices loves your child like you do. I mean, who else is willing to die to save your child? Who's going to love you like that? Absolutely nobody. You know, there's a reason that a lot of scholars over the centuries have suggested a direct parallel between the first commandment and the fifth, the one that deals with honoring your parents. And there's a really good reason that God reveals Himself as a father in the Bible, because at the end of the day, there's nobody you can trust like the one who created you. Now, of course, as we make our way through life, a lot of us learn the hard way that our parents did have our very best interests at heart. And sometimes, unfortunately, we only figure that out when it's a little too late. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, we're back from the break, and we were talking about this parallel you can find between the first commandment and the fifth commandment. In the fifth commandment, God tells us to honor our parents so that our lives can be fulfilling and prosperous. And in an ideal world, nobody really has your back like your mom and dad. And I promise you, in this universe, nobody has your back quite like God does. I know that sometimes people look at this commandment as if God is some kind of cosmic narcissist who demands our attention. But that's not the essence of the first commandment. I mean, let's just think about this rationally. If there really is a God, and there's only one God, then putting anything else in His place is only going to lead to a world of pain and heartache. How in the world would it help you to form an intimate relationship with something that is not your maker? So, now let's read the commandment one more time, starting in Exodus 20 and verse 1. It says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." It really is that simple. And if I didn't have to fill 28 minutes and 30 seconds today, we'd already be done. Putting anything that isn't God in God's place, that's only going to end in disaster. And if God is love, why in the world would He turn you loose in this world without any kind of warning about the dangers out there? Now, the Bible does make it clear that He's not going to force you to worship Him because, well, that's not how love works. But a God of love is also going to care enough to tell you the truth. He's going to warn you about the pitfalls because He cares. Now, it might also be helpful to look at another important human relationship, and that's the one you find in marriage. The Bible often describes God's covenant people as a bride. And so you might want to ask yourself, what is the potential for a healthy marriage if you choose to include a third person? I mean, apart from a really bad episode of Jerry Springer, where do you think that's going to get you? The marriage covenant reminds me every day that my wife comes first. And if I put something else in her place, it's going to damage the joy that God intended us to have in our relationship. So, in the story of the Exodus, God's covenant people, His wife, if you will, they're about to enter the land of promise. Or at least they were supposed to, until their violation of the covenant led to exile in the desert for another 40 years. Listen to this interesting passage found in Exodus 23, just a few pages after the Ten Commandments. Listen to what God says in Exodus 23:31, where He explains why the present occupants of the land, the Canaanites, well, they have to be removed. Here's what it says. "You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." So here's what I want you to notice. God's primary concern here is for the welfare of His people. This is not a matter of divine narcissism. It's a matter of what's best for you. If you choose to serve other gods, you're going to discover it's a very painful trap because other gods are nothing but human fabrications. I'm reminded again of one of my favorite ancient characters, Xenophanes, a guy I've talked about on this show over and over and over. He was an early Greek philosopher who rejected the pagan pantheon because, well, the gods were behaving so badly, it was just getting really embarrassing. He realized that false gods are just projections of human beings, and he made that point by saying this: "But if horses or oxen or lions had hands, or could draw with their hands and accomplish such works as men, horses would draw the figures of the gods as similar to horses, and the oxen as similar to oxen, and they would make the bodies of the sort which each of them had." So, in other words, the pagan gods were looking bad because they were made in our image. They were just projections of fallen humanity, and they were saddled with some of our very worst qualities. And the problem with that is that people tend to become what they worship. And if you create your own God and your God just looks like you've got this circular problem that gets worse with time. The pagan gods were nothing more than a terrible caricature of what a human being is supposed to be. And when you worship those gods, you yourself become something less than human. And then you project those new, worse qualities back on the gods, and the cycle continues. Those who make them become like them, the Bible says. So there's a good reason that God forbids it. It's because a false god is going to make you less than human. It's going to make you something less than the image of God. And at the end of the day, you're the one who gets hurt. I'll be right back after this.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Well, look at that. I've run out of time again because, well, I have this gift for blabbing. But maybe let me sum it all up like this. The Ten Commandments are not the work of a God who's trying to rob you of a good and decent life. In fact, the opposite is true. The moral law holds the key to discovering an authentic human existence because it reveals the character of God. And you and I were made in His image. Worship the real God and live the way that He suggests, and He begins to restore you. He begins to give you something definitely more authentic. I know that in this day and age, some people are terribly offended by the exclusive claims of the biblical God. And it's popular today to say that there are many paths up the mountain, that they all lead to the same place. But that's just not true. In fact, it's a dangerous lie. In the not-so-distant past, other gods led us to things like human sacrifice or unspeakable sexual practices, and it really distorted the image of God to the point where you couldn't see Him in humanity anymore. The pain and suffering that follows in the wake of putting something else in God's place, well, that devastation can be unspeakable. You and I might not be building massive pyramids to a sun god where we go and rip out the still beating heart of our enemies as an act of devotion. But the harm caused by worshiping other gods is still playing out in our generation. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, we saw powerful people suggest that rationality alone can solve our very worst problems, and we elevated our capacity for reason to the status of a god. And some people who claim to be disciples of rational thought ended up elevating the state itself to the level of a god. And when some people didn't fit the ambitions of the tyrants who ran that state, tens of millions were sacrificed on the altar of human ambition. I mean, just hop on YouTube and watch a few Nazi rallies from the 30s or 40s, or watch some of Stalin's propaganda and tell me they don't have religious overtones. They do. And every time we put something or somebody in God's place, it only makes the pain and suffering worse for everybody. Meanwhile, here in the pages of the Bible, we have a God who makes this astonishing promise for people who put the one true God on the throne of their hearts. The Bible says, therefore, they are before the throne of God, and serve Him day and night in His temple. And He who sits on the throne will shelter them with His presence. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and He will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So you tell me, does the first commandment make really good sense? Yeah, it does. And I can tell you, as someone who's lived with God and without God, this really is the better way to live. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and you've been watching Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.